started playing football at age 9. I watched the New York Jets beat the Baltimore Colts in the NFL championship game, and that my dream of becoming an NFL player was alive and thriving at that point. And a funny story is that I started playing when I was 9. Me and my little buddies in the backyard, back and forth. We had flag, but we wanted to play tackle. We had a flag league, but we wanted to play tackle, so we did in the yard. And I was so physical with my teammates, or my kids, my peers. By the time we were 12, they wouldn't play with me anymore. And so at age 12, I started having to play tackle football with the high school boys, which was lessons. I learned life lessons. And I remember telling myself as a 12-year-old boy when I got knocked down by a 17-year-old that if I was going to be a pro player, I had to be able to get up after being knocked down by a kid from Boonville. So that was kind of my inspiration and mindset. But that really was part of my upbringing as far as football. That was very much the dream of mine.
Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential.
Welcome to the American Potential Podcast. I'm your host, David Fromm. Sometimes it's kind of wild to think about what one person can live through in a single lifetime. Things like world wars, desegregation, the fall of communism, 9/11, even COVID. And these kinds of events shape our world in big ways. But for today's guest, the experience that shaped him the most was growing up in a small southern town where the color of your skin determined just about everything. He grew up in a place where racial lines were still very real, and no one worked on crossing them publicly. His childhood wasn't easy, but something changed when a white teammate's family welcomed him into their home. That simple act opened his eyes and started to shift his perspective. From there, Ron went on to play football at the college level and eventually made it to the NFL, including time with the Kansas City Chiefs. But his story didn't stop on the field. Today, he's a speaker, a leader, and the author of Rethinking Race, It's Better Than We've Been Led to Believe, a powerful book that challenges us to take a more honest and hopeful look at how we talk about race in America. We're excited to hear more about his personal story, his football career, and what led him to write this book. I want to welcome to the podcast, Ron Freeman. Ron, welcome.
David, thank you. Glad to join you.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm really excited for our conversation. I touched on a little bit in the intro, but can you share some more of what it was like for you growing up in a small southern town in the 1960s?
Right. Well, no, it's interesting that you would call it a small southern town because it's actually I'm in Missouri, but the region that I lived in Missouri was called Little Dixie because it was a Confederate hotbed back during the Civil War. But from Jefferson City, Missouri, running along the Missouri River up north to Liberty, Missouri, north of Kansas City, it was a region that was Little Dixie. And it was very much a Confederate and Southern. I call it sweet tea, good old boys and rednecks. It's just kind of how life was there. But growing up there, in a time of Jim Crow, segregated, I was born right after segregation started. So I started working towards it. I was probably 4 or 5 years old when they closed the black school and start to work towards integration. And it was just different vibe. We had what you call the Sundown town. There are areas of town that after dark, as a black person, you weren't supposed to go there. But that was just culture and part of the growing up. As it was in the 1960s, right in the middle of the civil rights movement. We had the whole Black Panther movement. You had all sorts of social upheaval with the hippie movement, the whole thing with the Vietnam War was going on. There was just a lot of chaos and confusion. And the transforming of my outlook, because I wanted to be a Black Panther. I believe that the only way to overcome white oppression was with physical resistance and to fight back. And that was kind of the mentality. And I can share the story in my book how a young teammate, well, no younger than me, but a teammate of mine in the 7th grade invited me to come to his house. He's a white kid. We played football together, integrated school now. We were on the same football team. We walked to and from school together because his house was halfway between my house and the school. And so we got to know each other. Charlie Wolf was his name. And the chapter is a panther, a wolf, and a God, because I was a panther and he was a wolf, obviously, and how providence intervened in our lives in that time frame to make a difference. And so one day he asked me to come to his house after school, and I said, sure. And after I said, sure, he informs me, he goes, well, I got to tell you, my dad was in World War II. He led a battalion of black soldiers into combat, and they abandoned him on the battlefield. And my dad hasn't spoken to a black person since then. And I remember thinking, okay, that's kind of concerning, because I don't know what's your point in bringing me over if your dad doesn't speak to black people. But I went anyway, and as it worked out, his dad was the kindest man. Mom was kind and friendly. It just really welcomed me in their home. I went so far as to say, even if Charlie's not home, you're always welcome. Please feel free to stop by anytime. And to this day, Charlie and I are still friends. Mom and Dad have passed on, but his older brother, Terry, and I are still friends as well. I became part of that family. They really accepted me and took me in. So that was a significant change of mind for me at that point.
Yeah, it sounds like, from your book, a transformative time. So when did you start playing football? When did that start become part of your life?
Well, great question. I started playing football at age 9. I watched the New York Jets beat the Baltimore Colts in the NFL championship game, and that my dream of becoming a NFL player was alive and thriving at that point. And a funny story is that I started playing when I was 9. Me and my little buddies in the backyard, back and forth. We had flag, but we wanted to play tackle. We had a flag league, but we wanted to play tackle, so we did in the yard. And I was so physical with my teammates, or my kids, my peers. By the time we were 12, they wouldn't play with me anymore. And so at age 12, I started having to play tackle football with the high school boys, which was lessons. I learned life lessons. And I remember telling myself as a 12-year-old boy when I got knocked down by a 17-year-old that if I was going to be a pro player, I had to be able to get up after being knocked down by a kid from Boonville. So that was kind of my inspiration and mindset. But that really was part of my upbringing as far as football. That was very much a dream of mine growing up as a kid. As you can imagine, nobody said, sure, you can do it. Most of the comments were, yeah, you're crazy. You'll never be good enough. But God had other plans.
Your town, you said that that the schools were integrated while you were in them, right? Or is that
yes? Integration began like 2 years before I entered school.
Yeah, so you probably, but for integration, you probably wouldn't have met Charlie Wolf, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Huh.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that when you think about integration and the transition in the civil rights movement, there were some major social shifts that took place during the 1960s, early 70s. That were significant, but somehow we don't talk about those changes. But they were dramatic.
Yeah, and maybe it's kind of providential. I know faith has played an important role in your life. Maybe you could share a little bit of how so.
Sure, and that's another, that chapter of the Panther, Wolf, and a God. After I had went to Charlie's house and had that encounter and got to know his mom and dad and family, I didn't grow up in a church-going family. I heard about Jesus, but didn't know anything really about the gospel. And the spring of my 7th grade year, I heard the gospel on TV. And I remember it was a Thursday night. Couldn't tell you who the evangelist or whoever it was that was sharing the gospel, but I said yes, and I wanted to go to church. So the following Sunday, I got up, I got dressed. God only knows what I wore, because I'm not a very good, when it comes to fashion, I fall short, but I'm comfortable. So I get up that Sunday morning, I walk to church, sit down in the pew. The 2 ladies in front of me were talking about me. And one of them said, he doesn't belong here. The other one said he shouldn't be here. And I remember hearing them say that. And to that 13-year-old boy, I just got rejected by the whole church. So when I got up and walked out of there, it was like they have no place for me at this church. As I'm walking out, I hear this little voice say, that's not me speaking. I felt like God was giving me assurance he wasn't rejecting me, even though obviously these 2 women were. And but the irony of that was, David, it was a black church. And so It really struck me, because I had this experience where this white family with open arms accepts me and encourages and supports me. I go to a black church and I'm told I don't belong there. And so it really that whole paradigm of Black Panther, Black Power, and overcoming white man was suddenly content of character instead of color of skin became real important to me as a 13-year-old kid, because it really opened my eyes. So that began my journey, I think, in a lot of ways. And my racial story was really shaped and fashioned in a lot of ways that year as much as it was in my sports dream.
Yeah. So you're playing high school football alongside Charlie, and then you end up excelling, obviously, because you went and played college football and then onto the NFL. Maybe
Sure.
Take us through that journey a little bit.
Yeah, went on to Pittsburgh State, and it was kind of interesting because I didn't have the typical recruiting process. Of course, back then recruiting was a whole different world than it is today. But I would get letters from school and from schools around the country, and I would think, well, if they're serious, they'll follow up. Well, they didn't keep following up, but I ended up going to Pittsburgh State because I went on a recruiting trip with a friend of mine, and they were watching the film with the defensive coach, and he goes, "Who's that number 64 right there?" And I said, "Coach, that's me." And that's how I got recruited to Pittsburgh State. But went there, earned the starting position as a freshman, as a defensive tackle, played there, was a starter, 4-year starter, was an All-American my senior year, and ended up signing a free agent contract with the Buffalo Bills. And that was kind of the beginning of my pro career. And it was a transition because I played defensive line in college and moved the linebacker with the Bills. After I got released by the Bills, the USFL called, and I went to work with the Pittsburgh Maulers, and then played with the Orlando Renegades for a couple of years before landing in Kansas City for my last year. And then after I played for the Chiefs, I became the team chaplain for about 7 years. So kind of a full cycle to work in both.
That's fabulous. I actually want to go back to going from defensive tackle to middle linebacker. Seems like quite a dramatic change. I mean, the athleticism, I mean, just the size and athleticism is.
Oh yeah, it really
says a lot about you as a player.
Yeah. Well, I was a 6'2", 228-pound defensive tackle. So.
Oh wow.
I was undersized, but I ran a high 4.5. 4.6 40, so I was a lot quicker than the big guys, so I could get around them pretty easy.
Got it.
But the transition was interesting because when I was with the Bills, when it came to the run stopper, I was as good as anybody we had. When it came to a passing game, it was an adjustment. Oh man, I tell you, the thing that you don't realize because you're just part of it. But I remember going to after I got cut by the Bills, I remember going to a Chiefs-Bills game and watching them play and seeing how fast the game moves. Because when you're in it, it just seems like normal. But when you're, as a fan, you look at it from the outside in, and you're like, wow, this is people get around. And it's such a fast game. And I'm sure part of my transition from defensive tackle to linebacker at that point was the speed of the game was so different for me. And I remember, different things and different plays, and you learn and acclimate. And so by the time I got to the USFL, I had acclimated and I knew the speed of the game, and I played it. It was just natural for me. So, but the first year was a real challenge.
So you said you became the chaplain after you stopped playing with the Chiefs. I'd never thought of that being a reality. Like, that's kind of a cool transition, because I imagine you have the confidence and the relationships with at least the players who are still there, and the shared experience, but then being able to, be the person who's helping them spiritually seems like a pretty cool opportunity and kind of interesting.
Yeah, it was. It was a great time. Actually, I started working at the time after I left the Chiefs. I started working with the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, and it was in that role that I took on the responsibility of being team chaplain with the Chiefs as well. And you do, because you the background, the environment. You're really working. I was working with my peers, so that was kind of made it very easy, an easy transition. And I think we had a positive impact on the organization from that role.
So after you're working for the NFL or working in the NFL, you've transitioned to becoming a speaker and an author. What was that journey like?
Oh, that was it. Actually, when the transition point was actually, I worked with FCA and then decided to run for Congress. And company policy, can't be involved with politics and working in the organization. So I had to find something else to do. And so the real natural thing was the motivational speaker, the leadership consultant was kind of the next role. And so that's what got that started. But went to work Well, actually, I ran for Congress in Kansas City in our 5th district, which is a district it's been Democrat stronghold since 1948. And so it was an uphill battle. I ran as a Republican. I ended up taking second place in the fall. I haven't conceded yet, but I took second place and but lived and learned, but transitioned from that to doing the motivational speaking. Found out that, it's a pretty effective motivational speaker. Learned that with FCA too, just being involved in people's lives and understanding and identifying where people are coming from, being able to connect with people across the board, ethnically, across the board, socioeconomically. So it really made it easy for me as a motivational speaker to engage and connect with people. And so that's kind of been my journey since that time. I've done a number of things in the business world, and including I had a small business supplying safety products to railroad companies for about 12 years. Went to work with the NFLPA, working as an agent and representative a few years ago for about 8 years. So doing a lot of different things and enjoying, but at the end of the day, I'm a motivational speaker and an author who wrote a couple of books, one in 2013, and then just last year published Rethinking Race. And so that's kind of been fun. It's been interesting talking to people about the concept of rethinking race, which is what I do. I love engaging people and opening eyes to possibilities and inspiring actions that shape our world.
Yeah, talk to me more about Rethinking Race. So the title is Rethinking Race. It's better than we have been led to believe. Yes. Tell me about what led you to write the book, and what you want to convey to people.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, it's really part of my story, which I guess I've been thinking this. I started looking at old notes of things because I like to take notes when I'm reading, I'm thinking and processing and praying. And so this idea of rethinking race has kind of been in the grinder probably for 20 years or more. But in the acute sense, it was the summer of 2019. And I was working as a consultant to Lee Summit School District, which is one of the larger districts here in Kansas City, and working with a superintendent and this leadership team. I'd been doing it for about 3 years. And they had a transition in the superintendent role. And they hire a guy who happened to be Black. And he came in, and I worked with him for about 6 months, and things seemed to be going smoothly. We put out a couple of fires. We had one situation where one of his assistant superintendents didn't respond in a way that he thought was productive, and he asked me if I thought it was rape because he was Black and she couldn't relate to a Black in leadership. I said, I don't think that's what it is. So we sit down with her and talk about what the issue was, and turns out, and I did a lot with personality profiles and kind of how people respond to certain leadership types. And what happened with her was that he came to her at, I want to say 2:30 in the afternoon, saying, I need this project done by 3:30. And her personality profile was such that if you give that person a tight deadline with no time to process what you just gave them, they shut down. It's just psychologically, that's how they work. And we talked him through that. And she actually became one of his chief lieutenants. He became one of his key supporters. So we worked through that issue. But shortly after that, he asked me one day to come meet him. He goes, can I meet you out of town? Which sounded kind of weird. And because you're in Kansas City. And I said, sure. So we meet, and he sits down and he goes, hey, can your training prove that this community is racist? And when I said no, our relationship was over. He didn't want to work with me anymore. And the very next week, Kansas City Star headline, superintendent says community is racist. So he really didn't want me to prove it. He wanted me to back him up when he made a statement.
Yeah.
And I actually joined another group of people who opposed that narrative for our community, because I lived here at the time, I think about 5 years, and knew a lot of people, been in the area for 20 plus years. So I knew a lot of people, had a lot of friends, and would say that unequivocally the community is not racist, but you're fabricating a story. So that got me in my own personal story to begin to rethink, what have I seen? What has my journey been like? And I thought about how many times I have a gift. I can get stopped by law enforcement for not driving the speed limit, or being distracted because I was on my cell phone. So I get stopped by the police, and I've been stopped many times, not bragging, but I've been stopped many times in Lee Summit for reasonable cause. But I've never had a negative encounter with law enforcement. I've gotten tickets because I earned them. I was going too fast or, whatever, made a right turn without, stopping at the light. One day, I'll tell you a quick story. To me, that kind of sums up my experience with law enforcement. I'm in Lee Summit, and I'm driving west on one of the major thoroughfares, and I looked down at my phone. This is where my distracted driving got me in trouble. And when I looked down, the light was green. When I looked up, the light was red, and I was 10 feet from it. There's no way I can stop. And I ran the red light. Well, there's a police officer sitting right at the light, going southbound. I'm going westbound. So, he watches me run this red light. I knew what I did. He knew what I did. And so instead of driving on like he didn't see me, I pulled over. And, he could turn on, and it was broad daylight, so he could see the color of my skin. He drives up, pulls up beside me. He never turns on his lights. He never does anything that would be untoward. And he looks at me and he literally chuckles. He goes, "You need to be careful," pointed his finger at me, laughed, and drove off. And that was, and so it's like, you hear all the stories about how law enforcement's unfair to blacks, blah, blah, blah. I've never had that experience personally. And I can, there's so many cases, so many situations that I get into. And that's what the book I wrote, the story for the most part, is how do we tell the positives about the American story? Because there are a lot of positive things, racially positive, about the American story, and we tend to ignore those things. And one of those things that we have to realize is how far we've come. Because I know I was sitting with another assistant superintendent who we were talking about this district, the issues. It was during the George Floyd riots. And she goes, "Hey, do you think racism is worse now than it was in the 1960s? And I said, absolutely not. It's not even close. I said, matter of fact, if this were Lee Summit in 1960, and me, a black man, were sitting with you, a white woman, in a public place, laughing and enjoying each other's company, you would have been sent home to your room to figure out what you did wrong. And I would have been taken out to a nearest tree and beaten, hung, or whatever they chose to do. And there would have been no recourse for either one of us. Today, we've got recourse. Today, that doesn't happen. You don't hear about somebody being beat up and taken out and strung up in a tree. It's just because we've moved forward and moved past that, because the American spirit wouldn't tolerate it any longer. So
you mentioned
that's really what the book is about.
You mentioned the idea of a sundown town.
Yes.
And you briefly said that. Can you describe that a little bit more for folks, of like kind of characterizing that time?
And David, I'll tell you this. I think it's more theoretical than it is practical. The idea is that in a sundown town, there are certain parts of town that people of color aren't allowed to be after dark. As a matter of fact, you need to be back in your own community before something bad happens to you being outside of your community. Now, I couldn't tell you of one time that I recall from my upbringing where someone was in the wrong part of town during the day or at night and had something bad happen to them. Now, is it possible something did happen to someone? It's possible, but it never made the news, never made the community news. So, but the idea was you just were limited. And I think part of there's things when I was growing up, we were already transitioning. The 1940s, 50s, there were some really serious issues like with race, and we read about those, we heard about those. But as you moved forward into the 60s and 70s, transition was happening. So we didn't have the overt activity of the negative, somebody stayed after dark, they weren't on Water Street. That's where most of us blacks lived in Boonville at that time, on Water Street. And so if you were outside of Water Street, the legend was something bad would happen to you. Well, there are a lot of people that weren't on Water. They broke that rule and never suffered a consequence for it. So it may have been more of a stereotype or a past issue than it was a present issue when I was growing up.
Yeah. Well, hey, so writing the book, I mean, ultimately, what do you hope the biggest takeaway is for readers?
I think the biggest takeaway, David, is that we've done some positive things, and if we build on the positives, we'll get more of the positives. And I talk in the book about the U.S. Civil War, and to me, it is the linchpin, it is the staple of the American value system when it pertains to race. And I challenge people to look at it in this light. There's a verse, John 15:13 says, greater love that has no man than this, than he lay down his life for his friend. And if you think about the U.S. Civil War through that lens, and you understand that 360,000 plus Union soldiers literally laid down their lives so that my great-grandfather could be free, that's powerful.
Yeah.
That's incredible and unparalleled in human history. For what I've read, no other country has ever made that kind of a sacrifice. Why don't we celebrate that? Why don't we put on the red, white, and blue and say, look what our Constitution, look what our Declaration of Independence inspired in the American people? Because that's what happened. They were inspired by founding documents, this idea that all men are created equal, the idea that we could form a more perfect union were driving forces behind what became the United States of America, and the abolition of slavery was really driven by that in so many ways. And I think there's so much in our American history that we ignore. And when the Black Lives Matter movement started back in 2014, my thought was, I think Black lives mattered in 1860 and 1865. Without question, because there's a very high price paid for us. And, one of the neat things in my journey, just a quick side note here, I was researching my own family history. And my great-grandfather was a slave in Little Dixie, in that region where I grew up. In fact, it was probably about 10 miles west of my home where I grew up in central Missouri. And the plantation was the S.A. Townsend plantation. And it is still to this day on the National Historic Registry because it was the largest land grant plantation west of the Mississippi. And so the actual plantation house is still there to this day. And last summer, I got to go see it. I want to see where my origin, my roots. But as I'm driving up the lane, David, it was totally unexpected. Driving up the lane, I started having flash visions of my grandfather walking behind the plow, of carrying water, of doing all the things that a slave would do on the plantation. It was just surreal. The lane was about 3/4 of a mile. The house was not the house from Gone with the Wind. I'll tell you that. It was much smaller and less impressive. But nonetheless, it was a place that things all got started for the Freeman family lineage here in Missouri.
Wow, that's powerful. That really is powerful. And to see how far you've come and the opportunities that you've been able to take advantage of and the way you can give back through this book and other, in so many other ways, things you've done with your life. Sure. So Ron, if the listener would like to learn more about your book, where's the best place to go? Best place to go is Amazon.com. And it's available there for $19.99. And I think it's obviously, I think it's worth the read. And there's so much that's there. And my hope is this, David, is that we can pivot from this culture of division, which the DEI model of, by virtue of skin color, I'm a victim. By virtue of skin color, you're an oppressor. And if you think about that model, if that's the dynamic of how I choose to view the world, there's no reconciliation. There's no coming together. However, if I look at this thing and I say, this is a human being, this is a person who has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is a person, if I learn to work with him, who can help me produce a more perfect union, good things can happen for us. And I love to tell the story, one real quick story about our founding and understanding the first martyr of the American Revolution was a guy named Crispus Attucks. And his story is that Crispus Attucks was a slave in Framingham, Massachusetts. He escapes from slavery, runs away to Boston. He gets to Boston. He gets a job on a fishing boat. The fishing boat had an integrated crew. In 1770, in the colonies, British colonies at the time, they had an integrated work crew that went out Monday through Friday and fished and brought in fish, and then obviously they sold the fish. But more significantly, every Friday they had a social interaction. They went to a tavern together, blacks and whites in a tavern together, drinking beer, talking about the issues of the day. And the cause of Crispus Attucks' death and becoming the first martyr
was that while they were having one of these conversations at the tavern, a group of redcoats overhears the conversation and confronts him and says, "You better shut your mouth." I'm using more modern day terms, but you better shut your mouth or we'll shoot you. And the addicts leadership, they stood up to these soldiers and said, "You're not going to push us around." And that was the beginning. The first martyr of the American Revolution, Crispus Attucks, was shot that day, along with 3 other guys. And that was the beginning of the American Revolution in April of 1770. And to think that this whole thing began with a former slave leading a group of white guys to confront the British, the supposedly baddest army on the planet at that time, and it began what we inherited as citizens to this day. And we followed the course, and you can see from that day forward, everything we've done as a nation has pushed us further and further towards the ideal of the equality of all men. And we're seeing that more and more. We're seeing the reality of forming a more perfect union. Now, there are noisemakers who want to make us believe that we don't have, America's racist, but we're not. Our nation's not racist. Now, there are racists in America, but the driving force in our culture is unity. Because, see, in a world where I learned to see you as a valuable human being who has potential for good, and if I can support and encourage you in your process, you make the world a better place, not just for you, but for me. And if I, in the same manner, you look at me as a valuable person who can help contribute to the betterment of our world, then as we work together to collectively be our best selves, we change the world, or as the gospel says, we turn the world upside down. And one of the things, and I got one more story, or one more statement I'd love to make, and this is the point of the book, I think in so many ways. The book is written as a very, very general, but I think one of the key factors of our racial struggle is that the church, the believers, the followers of Jesus Christ, have allowed the non-believer to determine how we view race. And so the non-believer says, well, we got racism, whatever past injustices, we're all guilty and bad and shame on you. Whereas the believer's heart should be, I'm redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. You're redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. God has made you and fashioned you in his own image. He made me and fashioned me in his own image. And together we can have a brotherhood and a bond that transcends ethnicity and leads to a healthier and more productive relationship. Those things are there for the church, but we ignore them because we embrace what the world tells us we should believe. And I understand that I cannot be a true Christian if my issue is I'm black first. No, I'm a child of God first. And then I'm going to relate to my brothers and sisters as children of God and my fellow man as people created in the image of God. And if I do that, then we all make the world a better place. We need that standard to help us all do better.
Ron, amen. We'd all be, society would be a lot better if we all internalize that message. Well, so, Ron, thank you so much for coming on and talking about your story, your book. I hope people go check it out, Rethinking Race. And thanks so much for just blessing us with some great conversation.
You bet, David. Thank you.
Well, folks, if you like this conversation and like this episode, please go and like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can find us at YouTube, Instagram, or Facebook. And always remember, liberty and freedom are easily taken for granted. Don't take them for granted. Go out there and defend liberty and freedom. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.